To
Awesome.
record it to my computer because my cloud is full. So, welcome to what did we call this now? I'm confused about what we called it.
Boundaries made simple,
Boundaries made simple.
I think. Yeah.
My name is Amanda Hess. I am a certified life coach. This is Elizabeth. I can't say your last name.
Transel.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Elizabeth
Yeah.
is also a life coach and therapist, correct?
Yes. School psychologist turned coach. Yep.
Amazing. Okay, so today, we are going to talk about boundaries. And I know that that's Elizabeth's jam. That is her business is built around that, correct?
Yep.
And I would say for me that it's a big part of my business. And I think that it's a big part of life and something that we all deal with and talk about. Um, I really truly notice with boundaries that there's a lot of talk about them, but a lot of times it's been my experience that people don't really know what they mean. Um, the one of the comments that I hear a lot is, "Oh, these people aren't following my boundaries," which is always a red flag because boundaries aren't about other people following them,
Yeah.
right? So I think where we can start, I can't remember what we decided. Did we decide that I would start and then you
Yeah.
would
Go ahead and kick
go?
it off. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
So I think that the first thing, I can't see my notes and I don't know why. So it's fine. I understand what I'm gonna say anyways. It's not a big deal. But the first thing we want to understand is what boundaries are and what boundaries aren't. So, a boundary is something that we put in place to protect ourselves, to protect our space. When we are in relationship with other people, there are times when what somebody else is doing is infringing upon something that you don't want to be infringed upon. And that can be a lot of different reasons why that's going on. But at the end of the day, the way that somebody is behaving is negatively impacting you. And this person is doing this in such a way that it's a problem for you and it's not something that you want to be able to coach yourself through. It maybe is not in alignment with your values or how you want to be treated. And so, what we will do is we will put a boundary up. And really, what a boundary to me is when you do X, I will do Y. So, when you say, yell at me on the phone when I'm talking to you, I will hang up. I don't even necessarily have to say those words out loud, but that's my boundary. My boundary is that I'm not going to let people yell at me. So if they yell at me, I'm going to end the conversation. And I think that what ends up happening is we think that what boundaries are for is to control the other person's behavior. And we want to be able to say, hey, I don't want you to do this anymore. And we want that person to stop. And the problem is that that's a request and not a boundary. And we can't actually control other people's behavior. I mean, it would be so great if we could, right? It'd be so
Imagine.
awesome.
We wish we could.
I just love
Yeah.
that for everyone, right? It'd be so amazing. Slash creepy, really kind of creepy. So that's my understanding of a boundary. Would you agree, Elizabeth, or do you have
Yeah,
another way you
I
think
think
about
how
it?
you framed it is exactly right. And one like little cheat code I sometimes use with clients is like if you can't say it in an I statement, it's not a boundary. So it's like I will, I need, I this. And I would also add that like sometimes we need boundaries with and from ourselves. Like we can set boundaries on our consumption of social media, on our use of finances, on our like all types of things that really they're just personal guidelines or parameters that we set up really to be responsible for the energy and the life that we live because ultimately that is our responsibility because like the flip side of we can't control other people is they also can't control us. So if I can't control you, you can't control me. Now I might be going along with some stuff. I might have said yes to some stuff I really not happy with, but that's my own decision to make or not make and boundaries really are much more about empowerment than control.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. That is where it gets sticky. And I think that one thing that I figured out how to make us like bigger one at a time, but then beyond that, I don't know how to make us equal size. So we'll just go back and forth
Oh,
like
that's
this.
okay.
So, um, let's talk about why we put them in place and why they're needed. And let's also talk about why we don't do it, right? So I think that most of us a lot of the time know that a boundary needs to be placed. Um, when somebody is trying to control us, when somebody is being mean, potentially. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, that's not the
Yeah.
best word, but I
Hmm.
think that we can all
Hurtful, unpleasant. Yeah.
establish. And when, somebody is treating you in a way that you don't want to be treated and that is interacting with you in a way that is a net negative for you. And, a lot of times it is family members, right? It's family members, it's coworkers, it's our partners, sometimes it's our kids.
Yeah.
And one thing that I notice for the people that I serve and the women that I talk to, and you probably notice this in your community too, is that a lot of those people would consider themselves to be people pleasers. Like that's how they'd identify.
100%.
They've been told that they're a pushover, but they also at the same time identify as a nice person.
Mhm.
So they are givers. They are oftentimes empathetic. They're empaths,
Yeah.
and it's a complicated thing because if they go and set a boundary, let's say, you do say to somebody, hey, listen, if that's the way you're going to talk to me, I'm going to hang up the phone. I'm not going to continue this conversation. It seems simple because it is simple, but it's also hard because of how you're going to feel about yourself once you hang up the phone and
100%.
all the emotion that's going to come in and show up when you put that boundary in place. And it makes us feel unsafe. In our quest to create more emotional safety by placing a boundary, we feel emotionally unsafe, which is why we don't place it. Would you agree? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I think you hit on like the thing is like so people pleasing behaviors, no one sets out to be like, oh, I want to be a people pleaser, but certain behaviors get rewarded. So like when we're really generous or we go above and beyond at work or we're loyal or we're this, that stuff gets rewarded and we start to get compliments and then our ego gets involved and then we do like that part of ourselves. And I don't think it's a matter of like good or bad. I think it's a matter of degree. Like we can be loyal and generous and kind and all these things and set boundaries. But when it goes too far and it becomes people pleasing at our own expense, it's tricky for people because they're like exactly like you said, they know they have a problem, they're resentful, stressed out, exhausted, whatever. They realize, oh, I probably need to set a boundary in this area, but they're like, well, wait a minute. Like there's a fear of just what's going to happen. What are they going to say? Am I going to be rejected? And then there's also so much identity work of like, well, can I still define myself as a good mom if I set boundaries with my kids? Am I still a hard worker if I tell my boss I can't be available on the weekends? So then what happens is we then have to redefine, well, what does it mean to be all of these things that I like about myself, that I aspire to be, that are good things, but what that looks like currently is harmful. And my process of redefining may not line up with how someone else defines it. Like I may think being a good worker is just I show up 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. I do what's asked of me and I do it well. And my boss thinks being a good worker is she can call me at 10 p.m. and say, we have an urgent task. Let's do it right now. And so then that's where it gets sticky because then you're like, well, I I want to be hardworking. I want to do this thing. What do I do? And so there's a lot of identity and emotional and self-esteem expectations work that's wrapped up in these boundaries, which is why it's so difficult and so layered.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with you. And what I would say, and what you spoke to, is that I think it's something that we build in specificity. And what I mean by that is that we take it situation by situation. So I always am interested when somebody says I'm a pleaser because I'm always like, well, everybody is to an extent, because otherwise we'd just be little narcissists running around and not caring about
Yeah,
anybody, right?
yeah,
So we don't like live our life not wanting to please other people. That would be crazy. Our whole
yeah,
society would be a mess.
yeah,
But it's about finding balance. And when we notice that
absolutely.
that's out of balance, that I'm saying yes to other people all the time. And in doing that, I'm saying no to myself. And I'm not giving myself time and space to think about what I want to prioritize, what I want to do, how I want to, participate in the world. And so I really like, looking at it one relationship at a time, and I really like looking at it one person at a time because we're all different. And
Absolutely.
sometimes we don't have a boundary, and you know what? It's not a problem because
Yeah.
you like how the relationship goes. So it's fine.
Absolutely. Or sometimes, even if you don't like parts of it, you like it enough or it feels safe enough that it's a calculated choice you're making. And so, a lot of the times when I'm working with women, it's like, I'm not going to force you ever to set a boundary. I want to support you to becoming more aware of how the patterns you're in might be harming you and what your options are if you decide to move forward. But you absolutely should be thinking through, like, one of the steps in the boundary setting process I take people through is anticipating the consequences or checking for feasibility, which means like, okay, I'm super upset and stressed out by my relationship with my mom. A boundary that I could set is I never go to Thanksgiving or holidays anymore. Well, an unintended consequence of that is then I also don't spend the holiday with anyone else in my family. And maybe you're not ready to do that. And it's okay. But the most important thing is that you are aware of how you are experiencing the dynamic and you're making thoughtful decisions around what works for you or what doesn't. And you can experiment. Like you set a boundary, you reflect and you're like, how did that go? Did that work? Oh, no, way too loose, need to tighten it. Or oh, no, way too restrictive. Like this is all iterative. There's no right or wrong answers. There's no final like this is it forever, but like how can we lean into experimentation and seeing how we feel?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think one of the big things, like you say, that does come up is thinking that this needs to be all or nothing.
Yeah.
And this can be many shades of gray. Nothing is final. You can always change your mind. You can move through it. You can take it one step at a time and have, I guess the lens that you look through being the one of curiosity versus I've got to find the right way here because there is no right way or wrong way to be in
Absolutely.
relationship with somebody, right?
Absolutely. And there's no one right way. And that means that like no one can give you the precise answer of you must do X, Y, Z. And then it also, which can feel a little stressful, like, oh, just tell me what to do. But the freeing part of that is like you also don't have to conform to what works for other people. So like
Yeah,
you can have multiple colleagues in a workspace that have all different types of boundaries because they have different tolerance for frustration, they have different risk tolerance for confrontation, they have there's all types of things. And it's like because boundaries are personal, they're going to be unique. Like even in my own family, my siblings and I have very different boundaries with our parents because we're different people. So but what I think trips people up is giving themselves permission to do that, because then that gets back into like guilt and expectation. Like, well, am I a bad daughter if I do this? Am I an
right.
ungrateful sister if I do that? And then that's really where people get stuck is in is
It's
in giving themselves
true.
permission.
Yeah, it's true. Your live says it's paused and I don't know why. So I just wanted to, oh,
Oh,
there you're back now.
okay.
So
There.
maybe it just like timed out on
Uh,
you. Um, I agree with you 100% that I think that fear is what stops us from placing a boundary. The
yeah.
fear of what it's going to create if we place it, the fear of the reaction of the other person, the fear of what it's going to mean about us as a person. Like you say, am I a bad mom? Am I a bad sister? Am I a bad employee? Am I a bad coworker? And then also, the fear of the reaction and how the other person is going to react and the fear of what other people are going to think about you, which
Yep.
is big, right?
Yeah.
Worrying about that.
Yeah. And also like sometimes when we think about fearing the other person's reaction, it's like, oh, now that's another thing to manage. Like
Mhm.
right now, I'm dealing with whatever is annoying, but if I set this boundary, now I'm going to have to manage how they respond to that. And it's like, I feel like that's a little of like yes and no. Like on one hand, yes, your boundary will likely trigger a negative reaction or can trigger a negative reaction from someone. Not everyone's going to hate your boundaries. Some people will. So there may be that reaction, but it's like, do you have to manage that? That's still kind of a people pleasing expectation because you're not responsible for other people's reaction to what you need. You may
Mhm.
have been playing that role for a long time. You may have been accustomed to being that person, but it's not required of you. And so that's even its own mindset thing. And it's something else I wanted to say when you're talking about the discomfort is like the irony of avoiding boundaries because it might be uncomfortable is that we are already uncomfortable. The difference is when you set the boundaries, someone else is going to be uncomfortable. But by not setting it, you've chosen a self-sabotaging form of uncomfortable. So it's uncomfortable either way. And it's just like, are you willing? Like, you've been taking the hit this whole time and being uncomfortable, which is why you're now feeling like, oh, I need this boundary. And I was like, but it's going to be uncomfortable. Well, you're already uncomfortable, and why should you be uncomfortable and not them? Like, when did you decide that other people's happiness was more important than yours? And for how long are you willing to live that life? And that's like some of the deeper work that people really have to confront. That I mean, this was me. I was a chronic people pleaser for years, exhausted, resentful, miserable, and it's really hard. But the only way to it is through it. Like, you just you got to sit and do that work, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I think, I had my very first life coach on my podcast. I recorded it today and, you know, I had her on because she's a feminist marriage coach, which I really love.
Yeah.
And she didn't define herself that way when I worked with her, but just talking about letting go of the performative piece of ourselves, right? Being less performative, understanding that we've been socialized to be performative and we've been told to be good girls, that the way that we're a good person is by giving more than we take. It's celebrated in the world.
Yeah.
So when we start realizing that it's not working, and that in actual fact, there are people taking advantages of us, there are people that are harming us, that we need to take that back. I agree with you. Like there's already discomfort.
Yeah.
And so you've got but it's familiar. So we like,
Familiar.
our brain loves familiar.
Yes.
And
Yep.
so we don't want to confuse familiar with comfortable. Just because
Absolutely.
it's familiar doesn't mean that it's comfortable. So we can actually decide to move into the uncomfortable. And
That's
the
right.
uncomfortable will be unfamiliar. But when we do that, it's going to create a different reality for you that is going
Yep.
to be more in alignment with how you want to live your life. And
Absolutely.
that's, I think, the big piece.
Absolutely. I saw a comment. Morgan says I can't hear her, and I wonder if it's because I put my volume down so it wouldn't be static. Maybe I'll try it. Let's see what happens if I do this. Morgan, can you hear me? Are you still there? I don't know if she's still on. Or Shades of Pink. I'm trying to test the audio. Can you guys hear me? Do you hear static on the Zoom?
I don't hear static on the Zoom, but there's nobody. I can't hear you talking on the
Oh,
Zoom, so you're okay. Who can she hear,
okay.
you or me?
Well, I wasn't sure. I was assuming it was me because I had my volume down, but maybe it wasn't. I don't know. We'll keep going. Um, Alexandra said she can hear us. Okay, cool.
Okay, awesome. It's funny, we're getting different comments, probably because we're on two different live streams, is what it looks like. I don't know. We don't know how it works.
We're just going like that.
We're new.
We don't know technology, okay?
I know Zoom inside and out. As soon as I open up TikTok, it's the Wild West for us. But thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Okay, one thing that you shared when we were talking about sharing this was your process, and you actually had notes on, I have other things. I did find our notes and I don't even know what to say. But maybe what you could do is you could take us through the notes that you had about actually setting a boundary. Or I think what you
Yeah.
had first was mindset belief work that has to happen before you start boundary setting. So maybe we start there.
Yeah, sure. So the thing is, usually when I work with people or I engage with them on social media, the first question that they ask is like, well, what do I say? I want to set boundaries. What do I say? How do I say it? And that's important because words give us confidence, words help us have clarity, and words matter. So I do work with people on what are the words, and we can go through all types of examples around that. But the truth is that the words are like 2% of the work. 98% of the work is giving yourself permission, believing you deserve it, preparing, practicing, anticipating the response, planning for what is your next step or consequence going to be if it's not honored, getting support, all of that. That's really the work. And to help people through some of that mindset stuff, like is really helping them, first of all, like understand what is the story that I'm telling myself in my head about myself, about relationships, and about other people that has resulted in me being in this pattern. When I work myself up, like, I'm going to stand up for myself this time, I'm going to do it, and you're about to do it, and you stop. What does that sound like that stopped you? Is it like, oh, they're going to be mad at me? Oh, this feels uncomfortable. Oh, what? Just like get in touch with what does it even sound like up there? And that like that recognizes first, and then there's a reframing process of like really interrogating, well, why do I think that? And is that even true? Do I believe that? Like, do I have evidence of that? Or is that just whose voice is that? Like really starting to challenge some of that thinking. And then it's really replacing and kind of almost reprogramming your operating system in a way because you've realized, okay, those beliefs didn't serve me. Those had me exhausted. Those had me, Elizabeth, falling asleep on my desk as a grown adult because my life was running all over me. Those had me crying on the bathroom floor because I was in a toxic relationship for 3 years and I couldn't get out. That story has to go. I know what that story does. So what else am like how can I reprogram that operating system to get a different outcome? Because what happens is if we don't do that personal work first and we just jump to setting the boundary, our foundation isn't strong, which means that when we are challenged by somebody, because people will challenge us for a variety of reasons, then we are tempted to be like, okay, I didn't mean it. Oh, you're right. I'm so sorry. Oh, yeah. How many times have we like walked back the boundary before it's even off our lips because we're so like, concerned with what they're going to say? It's like, if it's okay, do you mind? Do you mind boundary? I don't ask you, do you
I mind.
I've been minding this whole time. So it's like you really, like all of that stuff has to come first. And it's figuring out like where did this story start? What were the seeds that were planted? I don't know about you guys. I had very loving parents. Nobody talked about boundaries. I didn't know what boundaries were until I was a psychologist. So a lot of times we're just not socialized in a way to even know what these things are. And
Yeah.
then that good little girl people pleaser that gets rewarded is like, oh yeah, I love when people tell me I'm helpful. I love when people tell me I'm blah blah blah. So now I've become the superwoman of people pleasers. And it's like, okay, but I'm exhausted. So we got to
Mhm.
really figure out like what was the story that led us to this place? What does it sound like, that voice in my head? What do I believe about myself? One big point of distinction, and maybe you see this in your work too, is like a distinction of what I would say is will versus skill. So some people just don't think boundaries are reasonable in general. Like they just have issue with the concept of boundaries. Other people believe in boundaries, but they struggle to set them themselves. And so when I'm working with people, is trying to help them figure out like, do you have a problem of will, which means like you know how you could set a boundary, you just don't believe you deserve it, you're struggling with self-esteem, or do you have a problem of skill, which is like, I deserve it. I did the mindset work. Yes, but I actually have no idea what to do. And like really figuring out like maybe it's both. Sometimes it's both. For me, it was both. You deal with one, you deal with the other. But it like at the core of all of this is a self-awareness and figuring out like what do I need and why? How did I get here? And how can I do all of that so that when I do finally get those words to say, I'm standing on solid ground. I don't know if you see the same thing with women you work with, but I feel like 98% of it comes before you're actually even setting the boundary.
Yeah, I would agree with you. 100%. I get asked that all the time. What should I say? What should I do? And I'm always like, I don't know what you should say, and I don't know what you should do. And I could tell you what to say, and I could tell you what to do, and you won't do it because you won't feel confident in doing it. And it won't, if it doesn't resonate for you from the standpoint of this is what I'm doing for me because I believe I deserve to have peace, or I deserve to not be treated in that manner, or I don't need to put myself in positions where I feel less than, or anything like that, or where I'm being manipulated. Um, if you don't believe that you deserve to say no to that, you're
Yeah,
not going to say no to that. And
100%.
that's just going to be true all day long. And one thing that I do see, and I think it's really interesting because, and I'm sure you have this all the time, we have these conversations about self-worth, right? And people will say to me like, well, I need to raise my self-worth. And I'm like, yes, but, or yes, and I prefer, yes,
Yeah.
and um, we do that one baby step at a time. So it doesn't mean that you have no self-worth if you don't set a boundary, but it does mean that you're going to want to look at, I wonder why I'm not prioritizing myself above what this person needs or wants from me. Why don't I feel safe enough to do that?
Yeah.
What's happening here?
Yeah.
And bringing that level, like you say, of awareness and curiosity to yourself. Because once you go, the way you learn how to set a boundary is not just talking about it, right? You actually have to go out in the world. And like you say, you're like, okay, I'm going to set this
Yeah.
boundary. And then you know what's going to happen? You're not going to set it.
Yeah.
Because, of course not, because you've never done it. So you have to give yourself grace. And the ability to understand that if you don't do it the first time, second time, fifth time, 10th time, it doesn't even matter.
Yep.
It just doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Every day is a new day to try it again. And I like, to your point, I work with people to try to set the lowest stakes boundary possible at first and then work their way up. So before you tell your mother-in-law you're not coming to any holidays with their side of the family ever again, how about you try speaking up for yourself when they get your coffee order wrong or when someone cuts you in line? Or you could even try a more passive boundary of put your phone on do not disturb at a certain hour because you don't want any interruptions, closing your work laptop on the weekends. You don't even have to open your lips to set those kind of boundaries. So start with something that feels more manageable and build your reps and build your familiarity, and then work your way up to something that is more difficult. And I think just like anything else, like expect that it's going to be a little uncomfortable and remind yourself that the discomfort doesn't mean it's wrong and that the only way to get better at it is to keep doing it.
Yeah. I finally figured out how to make our videos equal, I think. Does it look
Oh,
equal on yours?
awesome. Yeah, it looks. Hey, David Phantom. Hey, welcome. Can you hear both of us? Say hey if you can.
I think
Um,
so. I think Morgan Bush of Books has been here for a while, and I
okay,
think I
cool.
don't think she'd stay if she couldn't hear us.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I completely agree with you. And, it is like you say, 90% of the work is really believing that it's okay to advocate for yourself and
Yeah.
that if you don't, that it's not possible to keep going the way you're going. Like that, you look at the definition of insanity, which is like overused, but ultimately doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We do that in our relationships all the time.
Yep. All the time.
And it's like,
I
if
did
you're
it for
married, you have the same fight.
years. Yeah, over and over. And I think like part of what happens in this space with boundaries, especially to the point that you just named, is sometimes we avoid boundaries because it would require us to tell the truth about the relationship we're in, and then we would have to grieve the loss of the dream that we had for that relationship. If I start telling the truth, which is that this person chronically disrespects me and I stay anyway because I'm afraid to be alone, and that this person has never shown that they're going to treat me better, I would have to give up our dream of happily ever after. And spoiler alert, this isn't just romantic relationships. We sometimes have to grieve the loss of the relationship we wanted to have with our parents, with our children, with our college best friend that we thought was going to be our best friend till, 80 plus. Like there's a lot of grief in that because sometimes what we realize is, oh, this person actually only wants to be in relationship with the unhealthy me, with the people pleaser me, with the walk all over you me. And now that as I tell the truth about that and am willing to step into something else, like something has to die in order for me to live. Sometimes, not always. A lot of us are in relationships that can accommodate, survive, and thrive with boundaries, but some will end because some people are benefiting from us not having boundaries. Some people don't have boundaries themselves. It's hard. And I think Morgan just asked, how do you work through that grief? That's where I'm at. I feel you, Morgan, because I was there with one of my parents, with my daughter's father, with a lot of people. I really just had to give myself permission to lean into it as a grief process and not judge myself for that, because for a long time I thought like grief was just for physical death. And I had to give myself permission to grieve the loss of dreams and be sad about it and journal and work through anger and disappointment and all the things that you might feel in response to a physical death or another significant separation, and get support. Like I fumbled in the dark on my own for a really long time. I was an expert at reading self-help books and I was an amateur at doing anything about it. And I needed help, And so this was like the peak of my struggle was pre social media in the way that we know it now. It was like just kind of coming out at that time. But if it had been around, I probably would have been trying to follow people with expertise, join some kind of support group, coaches community, accountability partner, find some friends that, are safe spaces that can support you. I've definitely been to a lot of therapy and coaching myself. So I had to I had to lean into it as a process. I had to give myself permission to feel the things. And then I had to get support because it wasn't something I was gonna get out of on my own. I had read all the books. There's a concept called intellectualizing, which is I was like an expert at that. And I used to pride myself on like, oh, I know so much about behavior. I've learned so much about trauma. I've learned so much about narcissism. And what would happen is, and I don't know if this happens for you too, Morgan, or if you see this with women, Amanda, is like when we're empathic, information can sometimes lead us to enable people because we learn about why someone might be doing something, and then we're giving the benefit of the doubt, even if it's really hurting us.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, oh, they did that because of this. I just read about such and such, so I know they're probably doing it because of this. And it's like, girl, it doesn't matter why they're doing it. You're crying on the bathroom floor because this person treats you like shit. Doesn't matter why they did it. You know, like it doesn't matter why they.
Yes.
So it's tough, but there is definitely support out there. She said, I just picked up 3 new books. Yeah, books are great. For me, books weren't enough, but they're definitely a valuable tool. And I think they're part of the puzzle. So keep going.
Yeah, I think keep going. And then if you can, like one thing I always recommend if you come to a presentation like this, take one piece of it, just one little bite-sized piece and implement it. Because our brains love ideas.
Yeah.
They think they're great. They feel awesome.
Yeah.
But implementation, we don't
Yeah.
like that so much.
Yeah. Either because we're afraid or because we put 3,500 things on the implementation to-do list and then we got overwhelmed and we're like, where do I start? Pick one. I totally agree. That's
Just
totally
gotta
true.
just gotta pick one. We love
Yeah.
ideas. We gotta implement because I used to read a lot of self-help books. I don't anymore, actually. I'm very careful with my mental diet when it comes to anything because um, w our thoughts can be easily influenced. So what we're reading is influencing what we're thinking, and so we want to be careful. If I'm going to read something, I want to be really intentional what it's for, and I want to be very awake when I'm reading it. So I understand that I want to drive everything through my value system and really actually be an active listener, thinking about, do I agree with this? Does this resonate like with respect to what I believe? Is this something that I truly want to implement, right? Because anybody can write a book.
So
And doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good book or a bad book, but it may or may not be the right thing for you. Like I've had clients and they'll tell me they're reading a book and then they'll come to a call and they're super anxious. And I'm like, you got to stop reading that book.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's not helping,
100%. And
right?
also sometimes like too much of a good thing at one time also. Like I saw this even when I first started being a coach, or I first started a business. I knew all about coaching, but I didn't know anything about running a business. So I was reading all these books and I was consuming content from so many social media creators that were in the business space. And at one point I was like, I'm overwhelmed. Like I don't even know where to look. And the same thing is true with the personal development space, like grief, self-help, all that whole genre. Like I agree with you, and I'm glad you brought that up about guarding what we consume. This is boundary with self, because sometimes it can be like a lot, and we have to um, really be thoughtful around that. And
Yeah, I
like
really noticed that with COVID, right? And I notice it right now with what's going on in the States because I'm in Canada. But even for us in Canada, I mean, like there's been like a lot of
yeah,
talk about Canada in the White House. And it's like a little shocking at times, right? And so I am very careful, like about having boundaries around my news feed and how much media I'm willing to consume in a day, because
100%.
a lot of it is not really relevant to my life right now. I'm pretty well informed. I don't need to be consuming a bunch of TikToks. I don't need to be over consuming news. Just because somebody else thinks it's important doesn't mean I need to think it's important. And especially, honestly, if you're going through something hard and you're trying to figure out relationships and you're trying to put some boundaries in place and really work through some mental and emotional pain that you have going on, you're much better off really being super, super careful of that emotional diet and making sure it's things that build you up and make you feel centered and grounded and okay,
Yeah.
because that's what you're going to need.
Yes, that. And the other thing is, some of the people that we love who desire to support us are not well themselves. And so, if we are consuming a lot of their opinions and we're inviting them as partners in our personal journey, they can unintentionally steer us in the wrong direction.
Mhm.
And it's not malicious. They love us a lot. They're offering what they really believe about the world, but they may not have healthy self-esteem themselves. They may be normalizing a lot of bad behavior. When I I got divorced because my ex-husband had an affair, and I cannot tell you how many women were like, "Oh, you should have stayed, girl. All men cheat." That's just
What? Come
yeah,
on.
yeah. And these were people that loved me down, like loved me, had my back, and but it's because that's what they believe about
Wow.
relationships. And that's one example, but I think societally we sometimes normalize bad behavior because it helps us cope. And so, because if we told the truth about it, then it would be like, well, wait a minute, why would I go along with that, right? And that creates a dissonance that's hard to swallow. So instead, we normalize, oh, that's just how bosses are, that's just how mother-in-laws are, that, and so you got to be really careful with who is part of this journey that you're going on, and really assessing like they may be an excellent friend to you, but what is their like, do they have the same values as you when it comes to this stuff? Are they in the place that you would like to be in? And it's okay to acknowledge that like someone might be your bestie for hanging out, but they're not going to be your bestie on this journey that you're going on, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Be very careful to really think about who you're bringing in to talk to you about things that are really challenging and difficult because it has an impact and it makes a difference. And for me, if I'm going through something difficult, I think you also know who you need in that moment sometimes, right? Sometimes we need the person that's like cheering us on and patting us on the back and they're like lifting us up. Sometimes
Yep.
we need that person. And that's
Yep.
okay. And it's good. Look for that person. Tap into that person. Sometimes, though, we need someone to kick us in the ass. And so
100%.
then you need to be looking for that person
Yeah.
because that's what
Yeah.
you need in that moment.
100%. And I think like, we can be so, I'll speak for myself. I used to be so sneaky with how I sought support from people because I knew, like, when I knew I really needed to hold myself accountable for something, but I wasn't ready, I would go to the more supportive, warm hug types because I wanted someone to enable me and let me off the hook. And I would avoid those kick in the butt types, even though I knew that I needed it. And it's like, sometimes like we just got to be willing to step in it and trust that like it'll get better on the other side, and know what we need.
Yeah.
So
And I do think hiring a professional does help with that because
for sure.
somebody that's a professional is really they're not emotionally invested in what's going on.
100%.
Your
Yeah,
friends, your family, they're invested. Your
100%.
coach, your therapist, not invested.
100%.
They're only invested in helping you. So that can sometimes be a really beautiful place to be, right? And, I love everything that you're sharing here. You're so articulate the way that you talk about it, by the way. I just love
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Likewise, this has been a great conversation. I'm like, oh, these are my people. This is my jam here. I love it.
So good. Okay, tell me, if you had somebody that came to you and said, "Hey, I'm having this really hard time in this relationship. I think it's time to set a boundary. What do I do next?" What would you
Yeah,
tell them?
good question. So first we narrow down to what are the areas that you want to most focus on, because we can set boundaries that our physical body, our energy, our finances, our time. Like, let's get really clear on what is the biggest pain point right now. And if you're like, I don't know, the whole thing is just stressful, try to get specific around like where do you feel resentful? Resentment is a clue to an area where you need boundaries because you feel like you're being taken advantage of. And it's like, well, why? What have you allowed? What's going on? So you get super clear on where do you feel like, all right, you know what? I'm going to focus on the financial expectations that my siblings have of me. I've been overgiving. I want to be generous, but it's just too much. So I've narrowed down my focus area. Then it's like, all right, let's just do a brain dump of what are all of the possible boundaries that we could set up. Even ones that you're like, I would never do that, but just get it down on paper, right? Write down at least five, maybe 10 of possible boundaries you could think of. And then you pick like your top two or three that you're like, all right, I'm the most comfortable in this range. This could help me. And then you start to go through that, like checking for feasibility or unintended consequences of like, all right, if I did this, I know it would solve this problem, but does it accidentally cause all these other problems? And try to get like, run through that, figure out how you can maybe adjust. And then you really start to plan not just how are you going to do it, like, yeah, you're going to plan out what you might say, but you also want to think about, like, is this a face-to-face conversation? Is this a conversation where I want someone else present, or is it just going to be us? What do you want it to look like? How can you set yourself up for success? I work with a lot of people on role play and practice. So if you're with a coach, definitely recommend you do that. If you're doing this on your own, I recommend that people like say it out loud a few times, practice it in the mirror, maybe say it with a trusted friend. Whatever you do, you don't want the conversation with that person to be the first time you've ever said these words out of your mouth, because that conversation is going to feel a little uneasy, and it can help if you've prepared a little. Now, you don't want to obsess about the perfect words. We already talked about that. That's a myth. There's no perfect words, but some degree of preparation, can help. And specifically, not just how do you set the boundary, but I encourage people to anticipate what the response might be that they get, or what resistance might be, and what will they do in that situation. And that's really a two-part of both what do you say, but also what are you prepared with as a next step? Meaning, like, what will be the consequence if the boundary is not honored? And that's not punishment, like how a parent would punish a child. A consequence is just whatever occurs as a result of another behavior. So if my boundary is that you're using the example earlier of yelling, that's one of mine too. I don't engage in like very loud yelling conversations back and forth. If you start yelling or name calling, I will fill in the blank. What will you do? I will leave the room. I will hang up the phone. I will whatever. Like, being prepared with your next step. And then I encourage people to think about a self-care plan as they're doing this boundary setting, because boundary setting is very challenging and we want a soft place to land. We want to be able to, oh, you're so welcome. Glad you could be
See you later,
here.
Alexandra.
You want a soft place to land. You want to have systems that can support you so that you're not vulnerable to backpedaling or changing your mind. And then I think once you've got all that, you just have to do it. Nike slogan, you just have to do
Just
it.
do it.
You got to try, and then build in a reflection process after, both on the actual process of setting the boundary and the boundary itself. How did that feel? What could have been more supportive? What support do you need moving forward? I hope people are not venturing out into this territory fully on their own, because it's really hard, and really just wanting people to be thoughtful. I would say, like, what I just went through in a nutshell is sort of like a condensed version of some of the boundary setting process that I work with people on in coaching. But I think it gives people a place to start, because none of those things have to be super high stakes. You can cycle through that process that I just described with confronting the Starbucks barista if they got your order wrong. Like, you can start very, very easy and work your way up.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I love that. I love that that's like a very tangible thing that somebody can take away and potentially look at and think about how they could implement it. And I think that you can also look at it from the standpoint of you can you can have boundaries that are not for other people. And what I mean by that is, like you said, when you're talking about self-care, right? When you're talking about nervous system regulation in particular, taking time for yourself, giving yourself permission to take 3 breaths before you respond could be just your own personal boundary that you never say out loud, but you just own it.
Yeah,
I just
absolutely.
own that, like, if somebody says something triggering to me, I'm going to let myself go and take a pause.
Yeah,
And that can be a boundary that you put in place that can be it can be one that you can start building confidence with yourself, right? Little baby steps. And to your point, I do believe like self-care, nervous system regulation, however you want to call it, very, very, very important. We can't talk more about, like, there's not enough I can say about it to show how it's just the most important thing you will do. I think that it gets overwhelming and confusing. So, one thing that I like to offer is that I like to dip into none of this is new, okay? But I like to dip into places that are easy to access. So, first of all, I love using breathing because breathing's easy. We already
yeah.
breathe. We already know how to breathe. This isn't about like teaching
Great.
ourselves how to breathe, but there's
Yeah,
many breathing techniques. The one I like, it could be wrong, but it works for me and it works for my clients, is just putting hand on your chest, breathing in through 3, holding for 3, and blowing out audibly for 3 and doing it 3 times.
yeah,
It will bring you down from a 10 to a 9.
yeah,
And when you go from a 10 to a 9, you're not as apt to dip into people pleasing behavior because you're not dipping into a stress response. And you're kind of convincing your body without talking to your body that a bear is not chasing you. You
Yeah.
are actually safe right now.
Yep.
This is just a conversation,
Yep.
right? And so like that's when I also like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, just using your senses, 5 things you see. I always get this wrong. I do 4 things you feel, 3 things
Yeah.
you hear, 2 things
We
you
switch up that.
smell, 1 thing you taste. You can do it
Yeah.
however you want to do it. Those
Yeah.
ones make the most sense for my senses.
Yeah.
But you can do that anywhere, anytime. You could
Yep.
decide to do that every time you go to the bathroom. If you went to the bathroom and every time you went, you did that breathing and then did 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you just did that and you did nothing else,
Yep.
you would be more regulated and more grounded, and it would make this easier,
100%.
right?
100%. And it's like, why not do it? Like, why not? And I think like it's easy, it's manageable. There's umpteenth research journals on the efficacy of this. Like, it actually really works. And it just gives you a second. Like, it just gives you a second.
Yeah.
So,
And it gives you the ability to just, the emotions that are going to come up when you think about setting boundaries, all the things that are popping up. Like, first of all, you're triggered by whatever's happening. So you've got really a strong emotional response whenever that happens. But then also the fear that you feel to place a boundary. And
yep,
so both of those things, if we can bring those from a 10 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10, it becomes easier to implement. And it's just working with your body. We do like to be action focused, as you said, and it's important to know the actions you're going to take. But what will become more important when you go to implement is
yep,
the emotional work that you're going to have to do to get there.
100%.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yep. I used to pride myself on being a doer, like, oh, I just take action right away. I'm just this. And it's like, yeah, and I took action into misery many times because I wasn't thoughtful. I wasn't regulated. How many times have we fired off an email when we're mad and we regretted it? It's the same thing here. Like you're buying yourself time, you're giving yourself back to yourself, and you're putting yourself back in control to make more empowered decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a practice. I think more than anything is it's understanding our whole life is a practice.
Yeah.
And so we can always change direction. We can always change how we approach it. We can always change our mind. We can take our time. We don't have to be in a rush. And when
Yeah.
you know that, then it becomes more systemic.
Yeah, it's like this is the rest of your life we're talking about. So there's no race, like do do it thoughtfully and do it well so you're not doing it over more times than you need to, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Where can people find you, find out more about you, look at ways that they could potentially work with you?
Awesome. The best place to find me is on TikTok or Instagram, and the handle is Boundaries Over BS. So Boundaries OVER BS. And I also have a website. We can maybe send it out if we store this somewhere, or I could drop it in the chat. It's www.posa-coaching.com. But if you find me on socials, you get everything you need there, and then we can find each other other places. And I've got lots of free resources on there, a boundary quiz and roadmap, all types of tools. I would love to see you there. If you come on over, say hi, send me a DM. I'd love to see you. How about you?
Yeah, I
Where can
love
people
that.
find you? How can people work with you?
So you can find me here on TikTok at the Amanda Hess, but you can also find me on Instagram. I am active there. If you are a podcast person and you love to hear things like this, I do mostly solo podcasts, but I do have interviews and I'd love to have Elizabeth on on my podcast. So we'll probably do that next. But it's called How to Love Yourself No Matter What. You can find that anywhere that podcasts play. It's I've had that podcast for a while. It's got over 130,000 downloads. It's something I'm really proud of. It's something I really love. I'd love for you to connect there. Send me a message. Let me know what resonated here, what you'd like to hear more about. If there's anything that Elizabeth and I missed that you'd really like us to talk about. Um, I just think this was really fun. I almost feel like I want to just make this a weekly thing where we can
I
just
know.
bring in people and we can talk about this stuff
You're
because it's
awesome.
so great.
Yeah, and there's so like we're just scratching the surface. There's so much more we could do. This conversation has been really fun. And yeah, ditto to what you just said. Like wherever you're catching this or however you're listening, like reach out. Let us know like what should we talk about? What questions do you have? What do you disagree with? What do you like, girl? You got that wrong. I don't think so. Like that creates awesome conversation. So we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, amazing. All right, I'm going to let TikTok go. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm gonna try and end it. I think I got it. Okay, amazing. That was pretty good. I'm gonna
Yeah.
hit stop on the record. It's just